Good evening. Um, it's not without a lot of apprehension I came here before you this evening. Um, I've spent a few days trying to prepare for it and did a lot of writing, threw a lot of it away, pulled it back up again. So it's been kind of difficult to pull it together. This is my first formal talk that I've actually given to people. I've given informal talks at the Heard Museum and at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Those went well because I was just kind of winging it. Here today is a little bit something that I really, just because of the work that I'm doing here, I am trying to honor some of my friends and my older brother, and that comes to the idea of the Pietà. But before I begin, I want to really thank everybody for being here. This is a true honor to be at the School for Advanced Research. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that I ever thought I would be here among scholars who have doctorate degrees and who are all writing books. Very intimidating. Also, I want to thank, if there's our teachers here in the crowd, I want to thank you as well. What you do is a first-rate profession, because I found out when you teach, or when you learn, you teach. Also, School for Advanced Research, they've done an awesome job for doing the PR work that they have, and it's been a little intimidating at times because sometimes you get bombarded with emails and people trying to get in touch with you. Next point was my work here. When I wrote my essay or my proposal for the work that I was going to do here, I had a subject matter in mind, and I've been thinking about it for a couple of years. And it was to honor my older brother and my friend Josh. That's been tough, because when I was in Tucson 15 years ago and I was in college, after my brother had passed away, Josh stepped in the gap. That was difficult. But he knew the exact things to say. But that being said, I just want to move on to my next point. And I'm going to start with this poem. And I thought I had a printout of it earlier, but I can bring it up now. I can speak my heart here. Don't let my ready defense take you by surprise. They are but confusion and doubt surfacing once again. There are times when the power is still with me, or rather still felt. But this is a time of tears for dreams and followed for naught, and relationships lost, and the dust of ambitions. I can ask forgiveness and carry that hope into the coming days. But I must forgive the moment. Choices that came with the energy of restriction, unknown at the time and out of confusion perhaps, but still with me, and still with you, perhaps. My greatest sorrow is your pain, yet day by day you try to help me see, and can be done to heal and rebuild. I understand and am grateful. Have faith in my love and my acceptance of the pain. I wish I had the author's name. He's a local author, and I was down at the the bookstore at the end of the street, and that's where I got it from. So, here's my chronology. I was born in Flagstaff, Arizona. I grew up in Winslow. I went to grade school there, and it's a very small rural town. And if you've ever been to Winslow, you know that it's like a big, expansive, flat landscape. So when you grow up there, there isn't much to do other than, roam around in the desert. And I guess that's where my art career started, because I would pick up rocks, sticks, look at vegetation, all of that, and I would take it in. I come from a family, all working class families. My dad was a railroader, his father was a railroader, and my mom's side of the family, my mom was a cashier, but she also sold cars before that, but she's had numerous jobs where she was really successful at. Her dad was also a railroader. Having two parents that work, you spend a lot of time at home by yourself, and so you have to learn how to activate your own imagination, which I would do in the backyard or roam around with one of my friends and out in the desert. And that's where my imagination was activated. For me, when I look at art and I think about art, you think about those early beginnings. And it wasn't quite a luxury. It was like a standard of what your imagination needs to do or what it's led to do. And it puts your imagination into motion. Growing up, I used to spend a bit of time on the reservation on the weekends with my mom or my dad when we used to be able to get away. So I used to watch my grandmother weave, and I used to see her loom. And if she was working when I was there, I knew exactly what the tools, everything, the apparatus of everything on the loom, what it did, how it functioned. So that was always something I had in the back of my mind. I never thought I would end up weaving, but here I am. When I was 12, this is a little bit more personal. My parents separated. My dad abandoned the family. My mom, on her own income, supported me and my little brother. So I was left, we lost everything. So we moved from 803 West Hillview, a nice house where we had a good income, and we lost my dad's income, so we had to move to a small studio apartment at 202 2nd Street in Winslow, Arizona. And it was a bit of a dungeon. And that's when I found out, we didn't have cable, we didn't have anything really. And that's when I found that reading would activate my imagination. And so that's when I found Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison. And through that experience, you see the struggle of what they have went through and what they can put forward and what the possibility is of narrative and how that it can affect somebody else's life. So with that, I'm going to start going to images that I have here. This is my grandmother. This is who I used to watch weave when I was really young, and throughout those years, she's been kind of a mentor. A few years ago, when I used to work for a hospital, I lost my job because they were downsizing people, and it was through her suggestion as an extra income to supplement what I was doing, that it would be a good way to make income, and so that's when I started doing rug auctions with R.B. Burnham Trading Company. Early on, when I was in high school and earlier, I had, actually my dad used to have Arizona Highways and Southwest Art laying around the house all the time. That's when I found Charles Lillama's work. But it didn't really become of interest to me until I got into high school. I have an uncle and a cousin who both do jewelry. And so I used to spend a great deal of time in their shop. And I thought I was going to become a jeweler, and I didn't. However, one of the things that I learned about Charles Lillama was his history. He was a painter. He was a potter. His father was a weaver, Rex. So I knew about that history, and I studied that history, and so I wanted to know what he knew in order to become what I am right now. But I'm not a jeweler. I'm a weaver. Next one. As I moved on through high school and I got into college, I really I went to the University of Arizona. I took a lot of classes, and a lot of my professors pushed me really hard to get to the point where I'm at. One of them is Barbara Rogers. I guess you could say she's probably one of the most successful Arizona artists out there right now. And we still keep in contact. We talk on the phone sometimes, but she is one of my inspirations. As I got older, and when I was trying to develop what I was doing, I took I was a two-dimensional enrolled artist at the University of Arizona. And most of when I was growing up, as I had mentioned before, a lot of the area around Winslow was very expansive, and I was really into landscapes. So this is some of my work that I started off with back then when I was taking classes with Barbara Rogers. So about 2 years ago, I had my first big break. After I started doing rug auctions, it was Barbara Teller Ornelas who told me, rug auctions are a good place to start, but you need to actually move on, and you need to start doing markets, start entering markets. So she encouraged me to do one particular market at the Heard Museum, which is called the Weavers Guild, and it usually happens at the end of November, beginning of December, and sadly they don't have it anymore. But one day I show up with this rug, and Ann Marshall showed up at my booth, and we started discussing it, and I didn't know who she was at the time. They purchased it, and they put it into their permanent collection. Little did I know, a couple of months later, they were going to have a big pictorial exhibit called Picture This. And this was their featured rug, and they included it in their newsletter. Not long after that, I was sitting at home weaving, and I get a call from Ann Marshall, and she says, okay, I need to tell you something. Jim Bellinger, the director from the Phoenix Art Museum, wants to get in touch with you about your work. This is all coming, it's like a tidal wave of things that are just coming like one right after the other. But I said, okay, so can I give him your number? And I said, sure. So he gave me a call not even like half a day later, and it was funny because I didn't know too much about Phoenix Art Museum. I had never been there before. I just knew later on that I found out that the Phoenix Art Museum, they don't show Native American art because they're a sister museum to the Heard Museum. They let the Heard Museum take care of that. So I didn't know that it was a great honor to be shown at the Phoenix Art Museum. Process. One of the most difficult things for an artist is, especially like what I do, is you're a narrator. You kind of give the audience vignettes of what your experience has been or the story you're trying to tell. And it's up to the audience. They're the protagonist. They are active participants in the art. They have to acquiesce, so they fill in the gaps. And sometimes you get into a place when you're producing art where it feels like you're rolling in the dark. And nobody can tell you or pull you out from it. And you're just grappling with certain ideas and certain emotions, and you pull it out. This is another one of the pieces that I did, and it actually just what I was talking about. It's called creation, but it's made out of chaos. If you research what creation is, it comes out of chaos. This one is called Mountain Wind. It is in the collection of Casa Vicente restaurant in Tucson. This is me working, trying to get through the day. Sometimes it doesn't always work. With this particular work that I've been doing, I'm a little worried about it because the strings have started to fray, but I've been pulling a lot out and then putting it back in. This is some of my inspiration. This is my first baby. Her name's Tootie. The rug to the left is called Tootie and the Birds. And if you see right here, she used to sit at the window when I was weaving, but she was so afraid of the birds. So here I have her like thought bubbles and a thought bubble here with like a fried or a baked bird with a fork and knife. But some of like what I've done here is, if you noticed with the color, it moves around her head and it's more red or I guess you could say blush. And that's just to intensify the idea of her thought. And then I have cast shadow here as well. This particular piece, I had in my possession for quite some time, and it was purchased recently, and it went into the collection of someone here in Santa Fe. Unfortunately, they can't be here today. The story about this particular piece is when I first started doing rug auctions, I was doing rug auctions with the R.B. Burden Trading Company, and I used to get all my yarn from there. And one day I walked into the shop, and Bruce knew who I was. Bruce is the owner, and so he is a big advocate for Germantown yarn, and he gave me lots of yarn, and he said, see what you can do with it. So I started like researching what Germantown yarn was about, and this is what I came up with. And it was came out of a lot of images that I was researching over the internet about the long walk, because Germantown yarn actually came out of the idea of, Navajos were taken off of the land in 1862, and a lot of their livestock and their houses were destroyed, everything. So weaving itself is something that's really born, and it sustains, I think, a lot of people mentally and physically. And when they got to Bosque Redondo, which is here in New Mexico, they were left with really nothing. So they would take a lot of their sitio blankets and they would unravel them and they would weave their own designs with them. This particular rug, this is when I started to get a little bit more intense into like what I was doing as a weaver, and this kind of leads into the idea of vignettes. It's called the acquisition, but it's more or less telling the story of how when you acquire knowledge, sometimes you lose your foundation and you have to regain it in a particular way, and hence the figure falling from the sky with his head on fire. This particular piece is called Winter Apparition, and it's more or less to tell the story about how sometimes in the dead of winter, or the winter of your own despair, you're kind of hoping for a spring. This was a commission piece by a collector, or from a collector in Albuquerque. It's called Concerto, and it was just talking about the movements of music. This is the piece you'll probably see if you come down to the studio tonight. You'll see this piece. It's called Parabola. And more or less I was examining the movements of the human figure and how the movement itself, your daily motions, how it kind of reflects what your life happens, what happens in your life, and the up and down motion. A lot of times, like, I think most of us, as when you become a mature adult, you're hoping that your life goes in a clean arc and moves down, and that's what this piece is about. But I wanted to bring a more modern twist to it with the skateboarder. This is called Eye Dazzler. And that was just like when I was experimenting with the technique of ply splitting. Earlier this year, I had the good fortune of actually having a show in Brooklyn, New York. And if some of you may be a little bit more, if you know a little bit about the art community, if you can make it to New York and you can have a show, that is it. Like, that's for you, that's the place that you go. So with this particular piece, I had it in my collection, and I had it at the Heard Museum, and I was trying to raise money to go, so I raffled off this piece, and this is my friend's mother, and she won the raffle. This is something when I was like earlier, I was like actually trying to explore a lot of ideas about narrative, about modern society. My mother told me a story once about when she was a little girl and my grandfather had taken her to the Holbrook. It was the Navajo County Fair. And I just kind of wanted to reflect on that idea of how modern society actually has influenced some of what we're doing. So I have a Navajo boy on a carousel horse, and he's surrounded by a very elaborate design. This is something I completed this past year. There's a collector in my hometown. She's Chinese and very difficult to work with. So I did a number of ideas regarding this piece, and it turned out rather well, better than I thought it would turn out. So that's in her collection. But this is probably my magnum opus so far. But the one I have in the studio is going to be even better. So my time here at SAR has been very rewarding. I think it has its ups and its downs. Sometimes you get to a state when you're working and it becomes very lonely, very difficult. And like sometimes, like I had explained before, you are rolling around in the dark and you try to pull this stuff out. And with the Pietà piece that I'm working on, especially I'm focusing on my brother and Josh, and that's been hard. Because memory is one of the hardest things that you can deal with sometimes. But it requires you to acquiesce in it. And that's been my time here at SAR. Thank you.